What I've noticed in conversations with some of my students and the general public is that many people think that climate change does not really affect them. It's a problem for other people, and its effects will only be felt a long way off into the future. For example, many Americans think that climate change is happening, as noted by the orange and red on this survey map from the Yale Climate Change Communication Program. Americans also generally think that climate change will harm people in developing countries and that it will also harm future generations. But most people think that it's not really harming Americans right now. Although it is interesting that there are pockets in places like South Florida and the West where climate change is already having a big impact, and you see more concern there amongst people. This last map shows that the vast majority of Americans think that climate change will not harm them personally. This is simply wrong. Climate change is affecting everyone, and its impacts will worsen. I think that people in developed countries tend to put a lot of what's called psychological distance between climate change and themselves. They think it will not affect me, and certainly not soon. Therefore, why worry too much about it? In this video, I will discuss how climate change is already affecting people in developed nations like the United States through extreme events, and how these impacts will only get worse unless fossil fuel emissions are drastically reduced in order to limit future climate change. The world has warmed by around 1 degree Celsius since 1850 due to human activity. For a discussion of how science tells us that humans are responsible, please watch my other videos on the topic. That 1 degree Celsius or roughly 2 Fahrenheit increase may not seem like very much, but it is enough to greatly increase the likelihood of extreme events. Human-induced climate change has altered the behavior of the atmosphere and made many weather extremes much more likely. This diagram illustrates how climate change is altering the probability of extremely hot weather. As the atmosphere warms, the curve shifts to the right, and the risk of having extremely hot weather and even never before seen hot weather gets much higher. This curve is for temperature, but climate change can also make other weather extremes like hurricanes, droughts, floods, and wildfires much more likely. Climate change is altering the behavior of weather. For example, if I warmed up your body temperature by 1 degree, you would have a fever, and you would not be able to function normally. We are seeing more extremes as when we shift the temperature distribution to the right, we change the probability of rare or extreme events, and the atmosphere no longer functions normally. I think a lot of people get caught up in thinking that climate change only refers to small changes in global temperature, and that those small changes don't really matter very much. But climate change is not just about relatively small changes in temperature. For example, sea level rise is accelerating around the globe because of the warming. This figure from the IPCC shows that the world's sea level has risen by a little over half a foot since 1900. Due to melting ice and the thermal expansion of water that's already in the oceans. This may not seem like much, but it is enough to make storm surge and coastal flooding that much worse when storms impact coastlines. It is also exacerbating coastal erosion, saltwater intrusion into drinking supplies, and it's impacting ecosystems. Sea level rise as a result of climate change is already impacting the United States. For example, several islands in the Chesapeake Bay near Washington, D.C. have almost disappeared into the sea. These pictures are of Holland Island and the last remaining house on what was once a 160-acre island. Other examples from the US include how Miami now regularly floods due to higher sea levels, and the city is having to invest $500 million to raise roads and install water pumps to protect themselves from the rising seas. And storms like Sandy that hit New York will generally cause more flooding as the sea level is higher because of climate change. The impacts of sea level rise are already being felt, and the oceans will continue to rise under climate change. This figure was prepared by the US National Climate Assessment Research Program, and it highlights observed changes in climate across the United States. There are more extremes almost everywhere. There are more frequent and severe heat waves, droughts, and wildfires in the west, and there are more summertime and wintertime storms producing more extreme rainfall and flooding across the Midwest, Northeast, and Southeast. Heat waves have become more frequent and intense across much of the globe. For example, the European heat wave of 2003 that killed around 70,000 people was the warmest Europe had been for at least 500 years. Studies have concluded that heat wave was made twice as likely because of climate change, and it is predicted to become more than 10 times as likely to occur again in the future under continued climate change. Precipitation has become more intense across much of the globe as climate change increases the availability of moisture in the atmosphere and makes storms produce heavier rainfall. This figure from the US National Climate Assessment shows two different measures of heavy precipitation in the US. Both maximum daily precipitation and two-day heavy precipitation events have increased by over 40% in the eastern US. So when rainstorms happen, they are now more likely to cause flooding. Unfortunately, this increase in rainfall intensity is accompanied by longer dry periods with no rainfall between those heavier rain events. So the US is also seeing more drought as a result of climate change. Very large areas of the US have been in severe and extreme drought in recent years, and there is an upward trend in the percentage of western US land area in drought through the last 100 years. These droughts are threatening water resources and are detrimentally affecting agriculture by putting stress on crops. Climate change is also making hurricanes more intense. Because of climate change, we now have generally warmer sea surfaces and more moisture in the atmosphere, both things that hurricanes love. Several studies have now concluded that Hurricane Harvey, that devastated coastal Texas in 2017, was made 6 times more likely because of human-induced climate change. The increasing severity of hurricanes due to climate change is impacting many across the Southeast, and it is costing the Federal Emergency Management Agency's budget to be in almost $25 billion of debt. As the US gets warmer and drier between more spread out rainfall events, the risk of wildfire increases. An upward trend in fires has been observed across the US through the last 50 years, and these increases correlate with increasing temperature. Wildfires also impact human health through degraded air quality, as was seen in California in 2017. Fires produce smoke and particulates that severely degrade air quality, causing many people to have respiratory problems. This figure from the US National Climate Assessment shows that the risk of wildfire is predicted to increase up to 600% in the next 30 years as climate continues to warm and precipitation patterns change to become drier for extended periods. The impact of climate change on extremes is echoed in this figure, which shows insurance losses as a result of weather events. Losses from events impacted by climate change have more than doubled since 1980. This means that insurance companies are having to pay out for more and more disasters. Notice that geophysical events like earthquakes, shown in red, that are not weather related have no upward trend. If we put all of these observed changes together, it becomes easy to see that climate change is already having a big impact on people in developed countries like the United States. The insurance industry and the federal government are already having to pay out vast sums in response to increased risk from extremes. But the impacts go beyond these financial costs. Increased flooding and drought is threatening water and food supplies, and heat, wildfires, and storms are all threatening human health. Humans are already having to adapt to and mitigate the effects of climate change, and this is costing a lot. Under continued climate change, these costs will escalate. But the good news is we know what causes climate change and we know how to reduce its effects. We know that humans are causing climate change through the release of greenhouse gases from the burning of fossil fuels. Therefore, limiting emissions of greenhouse gases is key to reducing the future cost of climate change.